The year is 622 CE. A prophet and his followers flee persecution in their homeland, seeking refuge in a distant city. This, in essence, is the story of the Hijra, the migration of Prophet Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to Yathrib, later renamed Medina. This journey marked a turning point in Islamic history, not only geographically but also politically and socially. In Mecca, Muhammad and his followers faced constant threats and hostility. They were a minority group challenging the established order. The move to Medina, however, provided a sanctuary, a place where Islam could flourish. This newfound security, however, did not translate into an era of peace. The Quraysh, the dominant tribe of Mecca who opposed Muhammad's message, posed a constant threat. They were determined to crush this nascent religion. Medina, though geographically distant, was not immune to the political and economic machinations of Mecca. The stage was set for a clash of ideologies, a battle for survival that would shape the future of Islam and the Arabian Peninsula. The Hijra was not just a physical journey, but a symbolic one as well. It marked the transformation of Muhammad from a religious leader into a political and military one. In Medina, he was not just a prophet, but also a statesman, responsible for the well-being of his followers and the security of the fledgling Muslim community. This transition brought with it new challenges and controversies, forcing Muhammad to make difficult decisions that would have long-lasting consequences. The actions he took during this period, particularly those involving conflict, slavery, and intertribal relations, have been subject to intense scrutiny and debate for centuries. The ongoing conflict between the Muslims in Medina and the Quraysh in Mecca was not just about religious ideology, it was also about survival. The Quraysh had imposed an economic boycott on Medina, attempting to strangle the fledgling Muslim community. In this context of economic warfare, the raiding of Meccan caravans by the Muslims becomes a complex issue. Were these raids simply acts of self-preservation, a means of securing resources and breaking the economic stranglehold of the Quraysh? Or were they, as some critics argue, driven by greed and a desire for plunder? The Quran, the holy book of Islam, explicitly permits fighting in self-defense. Verse 190 states, "And fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but transgress not the limits." Truly, Allah likes not the transgressors. This verse has been interpreted by some scholars as justifying the raids on Meccan caravans, as a legitimate form of defense against aggression. Furthermore, the spoils of war were not hoarded by Muhammad or a select few, but were distributed among the Muslim community, providing much-needed resources and sustenance. However, critics argue that the raids went beyond mere self-defense and were motivated by economic gain. They point to the fact that some raids targeted caravans that posed no immediate threat to Medina. The distribution of spoils, while presented as an act of communal sharing, could also be seen as a way of incentivizing participation in these raids. This debate about the nature and motivation of the raids highlights the difficulty of interpreting historical events, especially those shrouded in the fog of war and religious fervor. Slavery was an unfortunate but undeniable reality of 7th century Arabia. It was a deeply entrenched social institution woven into the fabric of society. To understand the Prophet Muhammad's relationship to slavery, one must first understand the historical context in which he lived. Slavery was not a creation of Islam. It predated the religion by centuries. In fact, Islam, through its teachings and regulations, sought to ameliorate the conditions of slaves and ultimately aimed at its abolition. The Quran, for instance, encourages the freeing of slaves as a virtuous act. It recognizes slaves as human beings with inherent dignity and rights. Muhammad himself owned slaves but treated them with kindness and respect, even freeing some. He actively encouraged his followers to do the same, emphasizing the spiritual rewards of manumission. However, it is also true that Islamic law permitted the taking of slaves as spoils of war, a practice that was common in ancient warfare, and Muhammad did engage in this practice. Critics argue that Islam's acceptance of slavery, even within a regulated framework, is morally indefensible. They point to instances where slaves, even those owned by Muhammad himself, were subjected to harsh treatment. However, it is important to note that judging historical figures by modern moral standards can be misleading. The concept of universal human rights, which forms the basis of our modern condemnation of slavery, was largely absent in 7th century Arabia. While this does not excuse the practice of slavery, it does provide a necessary context for understanding the complexities of the issue. The early days of Islam in Medina were marked not only by external conflicts but also by internal tensions. As Muhammad consolidated his power and the Muslim community grew, he faced opposition from within Medina itself. Some individuals, like the poetess Asma bint Marwan and the elderly Abu Afaq, openly criticized Muhammad and his teachings. Their criticisms were often laced with mockery and insults, challenging his authority and undermining his efforts to build a cohesive community. In a time of war and uncertainty, such dissent was seen as a threat to the very survival of the nascent Muslim community. Muhammad, in his capacity as both religious and political leader, had to maintain order and unity. The Quran itself speaks harshly against those who spread discord and sow seeds of division. It was in this context that Asma bint Marwan and Abu Afaq were killed. While the exact circumstances of their deaths are debated by historians, it is clear that they were seen as acts of retribution for their vocal opposition to Muhammad and the Islamic movement. These incidents raise important questions about the limits of free speech and the use of violence in the face of dissent. Critics argue that these killings were extrajudicial executions, a brutal suppression of free expression. They see it as evidence of Muhammad's growing intolerance and authoritarianism. However, supporters argue that these were exceptional cases, justified by the extraordinary circumstances of the time. They argue that Muhammad's primary concern was not to silence criticism, but to protect the fledgling Muslim community from internal strife and external threats.